this is Lee back once again for another video, and today I'm going to talk about a few things that I really enjoyed, but I just wanted to make a comment or two on something. I've watched a lot of video game, channels on YouTube and other places, a lot of websites, nostalgia, and you might say, Lee, you're about, 20 years too late. This has been going on for quite some time. But, I just wanted to throw my hat, well, I don't have one, into the ring, and talk about it. Talking about video games, classic nostalgia video games. There's a couple of things I want to say, and people are big on visual aids these days, so I suppose I have to cater to that, demographic. But, with video games, there's a couple of things I want to say. I really appreciate that retro gaming fandom exists, since the 90s, the late 90s, about the time the 16-bit wars were drawing to a close, and, the beginning of the 32-bit gaming consoles. So just to kind of like bring you back into the time war, what I'm talking about here is the 16-bit wars were going on. The Sega Genesis, or Mega Drive as it was known outside of the USA, and the Super NES, the Super Nintendo, called the Super Famicom elsewhere. Those two systems were the only survivors. The TurboGrafx-16, the PC Engine, had kind of gone out of favor in North America. It was all about these two rivals from Sega and Nintendo going head-to-head. And as things were kind of drawing to a close, the Sega Genesis had been dominant for so long, and then finally was overtaken by the Super Nintendo, kind of like how WCW was eventually eclipsed by WWF. Of course, Sega didn't go out of business. They stayed on for quite some time. Anyway, with the, about that time, there was this growing thing called emulation. And what it meant was, you could download these programs, or apps as they call them now, but back then we called them programs, applications for your computer, personal computer, and they allowed you to simulate, essentially, the hardware of these old gaming consoles. And if you found the software, the ROMs, read-only memories, you could actually play the original games. It was supposed to be identical to the real thing, so no more ports, no more translations. These were the exact games. And it may have seemed a little silly, you had your Super Nintendo, and Super Nintendo emulation was just starting, and, the games, there was no sound, and it was like, 5 frames per second. It was very choppy. You couldn't use a controller. You had to use a keyboard. It was very bad, but it was the beginning of something. People were getting rid of their 16-bit consoles in favor of the Sega Saturn and the PlayStation, the original PlayStation. The N64 was out, and there were rumors that emulation was coming for N64, and Nintendo was furious. Websites were saying, don't distribute the ROMs, the emulation's legal, but the ROMs aren't, and blah, blah, blah. And there was a program called Virtual PC that let you play PlayStation games on the Macintosh operating system, Mac OS, and so on. What's up, people playing Atari 2600, from the previous generations, on their PC, and it looked pretty good, and there was NES emulators, and Genesis emulators, and TurboGrafx-16, Neo Geo, Sega Master System. Eventually we started to get Game Boy. All these old cartridge-based game systems were coming to the computer. Well, today's generation of kids and gamers, aren't so familiar with these systems, except through nostalgia, except through these gaming compilations. You buy one disc or download, and suddenly you've got 50 games, or whatever. And, you can go out and buy the original game cartridges, but they're so expensive because of the mania. Well, I wanted to comment on a few things. I'm grateful for the emulation community, if you will, these programmers, some of them connected to the game companies, some just hobbyists, they came up with these things, because they preserved these games. But I think what they also did, unfortunately, is create this false idea of what these games were in the minds of many players, many who didn't experience, the gaming of the late 80s and early 90s and even the early 2000s. When you think about it, one thing I want to say is graphics. Graphics have always been, the big deal with gamers. People say gameplay is king, and I agree, but graphics are always what drew you in. Before the era of the internet, specifically the World Wide Web and places like YouTube, where it was easy to distribute, streaming video or high-quality video, back in the day, our internet just wasn't fast enough. Most people couldn't afford broadband, and you couldn't just watch a video like that. You had to rely on television shows, and TV, didn't have the frame rate to really display the games properly. Just the gaming commercials were usually very short, very in your face, hype driven, and the gameplay it wasn't exactly what you'd see on your own television screen. And we had CRT, we didn't have high def. But anyway, that's what I'm getting into with graphics. Today with video game nostalgia, you get these pixel art posters and t-shirts and, websites, rambling on. But when you look at the games, look at, Super Mario and Sonic and all these other characters, they talk about pixel art. Well, these blocky, things with, very little definition. The fact is, when we played those original games on our CRT screens, our color television sets at home, we weren't playing them on little phones. We weren't playing them on HD, widescreen 4K LED screens. We were playing them on CRT screens. Our screens were maybe like, 20-inch, 27-inch if we were lucky, about that. Some people had the bigger screens, but there was always a problem with those projection screens, they could burn in. Or we played the games in video arcades, and it was around 27 inches, these square 4:3, screens, color screens. Well, here's the thing about those screens. There were no pixels. I don't remember any pixels, except maybe in the very earliest video games, but Pong just had two rectangles and a little square was the ball, moving back and forth, bing, bong, bing, bong. Most of you remember maybe Arkanoid was a late spin-off of Breakout, which is a spin-off of Pong for one player. That was the big innovation, was playing against the computer. Multiplayer was actually how it started. Space Wars, Computer Space, Pong, all multiplayer only. Of course, these multi-million-dollar mainframes eventually get converted to coin-op, arcade machines. And then finally we get home systems, the Odyssey and all that. Pong consoles, blah, blah, blah. Most people know this stuff probably from AVGN, but I have a bone to pick with him, too. A lot of these people come off as experts on video games, and I'm not saying I'm a video game expert, but a lot of these people only experienced the NES, and then maybe they got away from games, and then all of a sudden they jumped into the modern, Xbox 360 or Xbox One, PS3, PS4, that sort of thing. And they don't really remember what these games were like. And the pixel art, I think, to me, proves it. What it does is it shows that people experience video games through emulation, whether it's on the computer or on one of these, multi-game emulation, because that's what it is, gaming compilations on like a more advanced system. If you play, these arcade games on another system, it's being translated, it's being compiled into another computer language, and a lot of times the emulation isn't perfect. I mentioned the lower frame rates. I mentioned the there's glitches. Some of these things really distort what the original game was like. Let's use a classic example. Super Mario Brothers. It's actually the graphics in Super Mario Brothers on the original NES in, was it 1985, 86, 85, 84, around that time. Whether you played it in the arcade or on a TV, we didn't see pixels. I mean, yes, the graphics were bad. I thought the graphics were bad. They were terrible compared to other games out at the time. What was fun about Super Mario Bros. Was the gameplay. It was a challenging game, and everyone had it because it was a pack-in with the NES. Well, I guess not exactly. Typically, these systems came with, I think, Gyromite or Duck Hunt, or they didn't come with any game. And Super Mario Brothers was kind of a late addition. That's usually how it went with these game consoles. They started out, the Genesis started out with Altered Beast, and later they packed in Sonic. And people remember that because that was a more popular game, but whatever. Super Mario Brothers, I mean, things were mostly orange or brown or green and maybe a light blue here and there, but there wasn't very much color to it. And yes, there were big, square, blocky pixels. But when we played the game, it didn't look like Minecraft. And if you play Super Mario Brothers on emulation, yes, you'll see these big blocky pixels. But we played it on a CRT screen. These were smooth. These were curved. They looked like cartoons. Cartoons with not a lot of color. No black outlines, but they definitely did not look like the pixel art people talk about. And you can prove this by getting yourself a CRT television from your local thrift store or whatever. Pop in that game cartridge, not an emulation, and just play it. Unless your sharpness is turned all the way up, you're not going to see these big square pixels. So that's a problem. People that play it in pixel art and they celebrate pixel art, that's not what the game looked like. If you're playing it in the late 2000s on a computer or an HD screen, a high-definition display, of course it's going to look like that. So the graphics are distorted, and that's what retro gaming gets wrong. That's not how the game looks. The CRT screens, they have lower resolution, yes, but they also have scan lines. It's interlaced, not deinterlaced. There's no progressive scan. Instead, these games looked very different from what you'll see later on. And you could actually take your computer, my portable computer. I have a little cable that connects it to my old school television, and I can play these games through emulation, but they actually look like the real thing. And I also have a game console with the original cartridges. Thankfully, I bought them when they were cheap, and I can compare and contrast and see that the screen makes all the difference. So, you spend $1,000, $800 in your U.S. currency on a HD screen, but for the old games, you really need the old CRT to make it look correct. Yes, they have filters, they have blitting effects and things like that, and the higher-end emulators to simulate that, but it's not quite correct. A lot of times, it's HQ, X2, whatever, Eagle Vision, and all these other things. All it does is kind of blur the image. It kind of smears it around to get rid of the pixels, but it doesn't. That's not how the game looked when we played it. So there's that. So Super Mario Brothers is a great example of a game that kind of was ruined by retro gaming, kind of ruined by emulation. It's not the thing I want to say about retro gaming and kind of how it distorts and misremembers things is with the Sega Genesis. The Sega Genesis from 1989, Mega Drive in other countries, and it went until 1998, I believe. The last game was Frogger, I think. The first game was Altered Beast. But anyway, the Sega Genesis, misremembered by a lot of fans because, again, of the retro nostalgia emulation thing. Of course, these games didn't look so pixelated. When I got my Sega Genesis back in the day, it had an RF modulator. It didn't even have composite video, the RCA yellow, white, and red, or yellow and white because the outputs were not stereo. That's something about the Sega Genesis. I want to say so much about that because people just misremember the Sega Genesis. They forget what it could actually do. That's the thing. A lot of gamers, they kind of bash old video games. They say, well, the old games, we thought they were cool back in the day. We thought the graphics were good, but that's because of nostalgia. That's because of rose-colored glasses, goggles, nostalgia trip, whatever. The graphics weren't that good. We were little kids. We were impressed by everything. Wrong! You are wrong. The graphics were quite good. Not for every game. Of course, you always had games where, you couldn't quite figure out what was going on. Most of the time when we said a game had bad graphics, it's because it hurt our eyes. It looked ugly. or because we had another version of the game to compare it to. Usually, like, there would be an arcade game, like Double Dragon. You know, it would come out in the arcades, it looked great, and then we'd see it on the NES, and we'd say, oh, it looks all cartoony and blocky and, small, and, the sounds are not realistic. It's all, dumbed down. Well, that's because the NES hardware was not as powerful as the arcade machine, and it couldn't do it as well. But we were comparing. Or maybe a game would come out on the Super NES and the Genesis at the same time, and the Super NES version would have a little more color, slightly larger characters, and people would say, oh, it's better. And then the Genesis, it would be slightly faster, so you only knew that if you actually played them both to say that, they were different. Back in the day, I mentioned, the lack of streaming video to instantly check up on a game and see what it looked like. Now, how it plays, you can only tell with a controller. But, the main way that we knew about games was through gaming magazines, which were based on screenshots. And screenshots don't tell you a lot. And a lot of these, they take a picture of the screen with a camera, and the image is washed out. Washed out image on the photo, they would retouch it. They'd add layers of color, which would distort what the game actually looked like. It didn't actually look that way. But if they didn't do it, the game looked all washed out with, like, no color. So with screenshots, the Super NES had an advantage because they did have slightly more color, slightly bigger characters, and they could take those screenshots and make the game look good. But who cares how it plays? Who cares what options you had and the speed and that sort of thing? Playability. Because gameplay is king, but graphics were what drew us in. So back to the Sega Genesis. The Sega Genesis, I think the main problem there with retro nostalgia is not so much the graphics, but the sound. Yes, the sound. Because you had, a proliferation of emulations in the late 90s, early 2000s, but you also had, commercial-based emulation. You had these, what they call TV games. It was a controller with a system on a chip, an emulated system, and you would just plug that into your TV and you'd play like a bunch of games. And they had one for the NES, they had one for the Sega Genesis, they had them for arcade games and so on. And they were deceptive. A lot of the Atari Flashback systems aren't even really Atari. They're actually NES systems. And they use NES versions of these games. Whether they're the old NES, the actual NES port of some game like Galaga or Space Invaders, or they're a modern version of the game created on NES hardware rather than the Atari hardware, so it's not authentic. I think only the Atari Flashback 1 and 2 use Atari hardware. The rest are NES, so they're fake. Why do that to a customer? Because they don't know any better. They didn't live through that era of games. They don't have the real thing to compare, so they don't know. They'll just pay the price and say, oh, nostalgia sticker, I like it. Well, the Sega Genesis, here was the problem. The sound is off. The sound is wrong. A lot of the emulations of the Genesis didn't get the sound right for years, especially in the commercial versions. The sound would be too fast, it would be pitched too high or too low, or the sound would be desynced from the action, and it would be wrong. The music would hurt your ears. Listen to Sonic the Hedgehog. Listen to the original, and listen to the emulated version, the commercial emulated version, whether it's on a TV game or a game compilation, or some of these early emulators. It'd be wrong, it'd be off. And people mock the Sega Genesis sound and say, oh, it's bad, but the Super NES was good. Well, you're comparing emulation, you're not comparing the real thing. So retro gamers are not actually looking at the real originals, they're looking at the emulations. So you should always compare. There's nothing wrong with enjoying emulation, but look at the originals for comparison. And that's where video helps, because, you have these YouTube videos of arcade games, actual machines. You have the original consoles and people recording it. And yes, it's not 100% perfect, but at least you can hear and compare and see what it originally looked like, assuming you can't just go check it out for yourself in person and say, that emulation's a little bit off. That emulation's not doing justice to the game. And a lot of times people remember ports of games rather than the real thing. I played a lot of Mortal Kombat on the um, MS-DOS, and for the PC. And, when I played the arcade game again after many years of that, I was kind of surprised. I thought, wow, these graphics are amazing. Because the resolution on the original is higher, there's more color, there's more fluid action. It's just overall better. The PC version did a good job of emulating the arcade, but it wasn't perfect. So, just keep that in mind with these retro nostalgia and all these people bashing the Sega Genesis. I have more to say to you folks. Not to berate you too much, but just to let you know that, hey, you're not giving that console justice. It's actually a lot better than you remember. That's the funny thing. People say retro gaming, they say nostalgia. It's looking back in the past with, because of our fond memories when we were children, and thinking that everything was great, better than it really was. Well, retro gaming actually looks at things and treats them as worse than they were, because they're not comparing the original, they're comparing emulations. The emulations which were inferior for so long, I mean, yes, they've caught up. I think modern emulation of these systems is pretty much perfect. Only a super technical guru could ever see the difference. But what matters is you have to have the right controller and the right display. If you don't have a CRT television, it's going to look wrong. It's going to look off. If you don't have sound, it's going to be wrong. The Sega Genesis had stereo sound. People don't realize that. But the stereo wasn't through your TV. I almost said your computer. It wasn't through your TV. It was through the headphone jack in the front. Didn't you realize that? The Sega Genesis had a stereo headphone jack. And, the thing is, you could actually buy a little adapter from any Radio Shack type of store, electronics. They're going out of business, I guess, but, you plug that in, and you could use stereo speakers. You could hook the system up to your stereo. Who did that? Mom and Dad's stereo system. I want to play some video games. Let me hook it up. Well, you could if you wanted to, and you still can. But only with the Sega Model 1 and 2 of the Genesis or Mega Drive. The third version, which was more compact, the slim version of a console isn't always better than the original. Sometimes it's worse. In the Genesis case, it definitely was. The Genesis 3 wasn't compatible, I think, with the power-based converter. Although I think they released a second power-based converter so you could play Sega Master System games on it, but who did that? But it lacked the stereo capability in the front. And so people said, oh, the Super NES had better sound, Nintendo's better. Wrong! The Genesis had the better sound through the stereo headphones, which you could also hook up to a speaker. And many of the best games had really good sound. And then the Sega CD came out. That was the whole point of the Sega CD. And Sega kind of dropped the ball, I'll admit this. Sega made all these interactive movie games, which had very little gameplay. They were more like Dragon's Lair, press the button here, press the button here, timing-based events, and it was always the same. Once you memorized it, there's no more game to play. It's just a movie. A poor quality movie at that, because eventually we got DVD. It was, 4 or 5 years after that, but still, who could afford Laserdisc? But anyway, the main point of the Sega CD was sound. The Mega CD's sound was amazing. It was CD-based. It was like playing a PC game, because PC games had CD-ROMs. They could fit these, stereophonic, high-quality soundtracks. And the Genesis already had good sound, but they could enhance the music. People bashed, Sega for re-releasing games with CD music. But the CD music was amazing. Whether it's Sonic CD or Echo the Dolphin CD, Batman Returns CD, Terminator CD, whatever, NBA Jam CD. I mean, those CDs allowed you to have better sound than even arcades could have at the time. So I think people missed out on Sega's sound. In those early emulators, they didn't even have sound. They added it later, and it was wrong, it was off, it was broken. And then finally it got good, but by then people had moved on to other things. People are trying to emulate the PlayStation 2 and the GameCube and blah, blah, blah. But that's my mini rant. I'm going to say more about retro gaming, but the Genesis, if you listen to it with the correct sound, whether through those headphones, stereo headphones, or through your stereo itself, your stereo equipment, your sound system, that's the way to do it. And on a CRT screen. And the controller in your hand shouldn't be a PlayStation 2 controller, an Xbox controller. It should be the Genesis controller. And you know, there's the 6 button and there's the 3 button. The original shape of the controller, I think, means a lot. And I'll say more about that. But ergonomically, the Genesis controller, very comfortable in your hands. The NES controller, terrible. Very uncomfortable. Little brick. I hated that thing. Hated it as a kid. Hate it now. It's terrible. It's garbage. It's trash. People remember it fondly, but that's nostalgia for you. If you had tiny little hands and you hardly played at all, probably okay. If you were a serious gamer, blisters on the thumbs, pain in the fingers, pain in the thumbs. Very uncomfortable. And who plays a game like this? Nobody. Nobody plays a game like this. Okay? So, anyway, more rants coming. Retro gaming. Love it, but it does have that dark side. It does have that problem. It does have that diminishment of these original games, which were actually better than you remember. Better than you remember. Remember that. Okay, well, it's good to be back. And I'll see you again in more videos. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.